So, why does New York City have a subway? Because of the Great Blizzard of 1888, right?
What prompted the subway to begin with was the Great Blizzard of 1888, believe it or not.
Did you know New York City's subway system was created as a result of a devastating blizzard? This is all thanks to the Great White Hurricane of 1888.
The Great Blizzard of 1888 was a huge disaster. New York City historian Rick Burns reminded us about it last night, of how New York City responded to that long ago disaster. New York City then built the modern subway so the trains could keep running even in the elements.
Even ChatGPT says so. And Wikipedia. And most importantly, this article by G.J. Christiano. But it's not true. That's not why we have a subway. And it really never made sense to me. Why would you build a completely new transportation system because of a once-in-a-century storm? We have a once-in-a-century flood. Are we going to put it back above ground? And we have a lot of elevated lines in New York City today, and they were almost all of them were built after the Great Blizzard. It doesn't make any sense. So today I'm going to explain this claim about the New York City subway being caused by the blizzard of 1888, and then tell you the real reasons we have a subway, which I think are a lot more interesting, actually. So welcome to Making Infrastructure Pay. I'm Kyle Kirschling. I'm a CPA and a city planner, and I've spent more than 10 years working for the New York City subway, and now I'm a transportation consultant. And I'm interested in helping people better understand the value of infrastructure. I love infrastructure and how it can be made even better, how to make it pay. As a disclaimer, these are my own views. They don't necessarily represent those of where I work or the New York Metropolitan Transportation Authority, where I don't even work anymore. So, okay. All right. So the first thing, what do I mean when I say, why do we have a subway? Why does New York City have a subway? And what I mean there is, why is the rapid transit system in New York, the metro, why is it mostly underground? That's what I really mean. And about 63% of the track miles today are underground. So that's the question. Why do they put it mostly underground? And this is actually part of a series of videos on the New York City subway and the unusual design that it has. And part of it is why it's underground. And there's other aspects as well that are answered in other videos. Okay. And there's a link to this. There's an article I wrote and you can download it, and there's a link to that below. So what is the argument about the blizzard? Well, it's pretty straightforward. And again, I think G.J. Christiano says it best. There's no overstating the significant impact this tragedy had on the metropolis, especially on transportation. The resulting standstill on the elevated lines resulted in the city adopting a plan to build subways. So you had the Great Blizzard. The elevated trains got stuck. People had to be evacuated. They couldn't get home. So therefore they said, okay, let's put underground. That way the snow won't affect it. It would be blizzard proof. And indeed, the blizzard was terrible. And it did shut down the elevated lines. This is a cover from Scientific American showing the blizzard right at the top. You could see elevated trains there stuck. People had to get evacuated off of them. I think that was really the main problem. They got stuck and people were trapped on the trains. It wasn't like they slid off the tracks or anything. But then obviously the line was blocked if this happens. And the other thing is the timeline works. So really in 1891 was when the Board of Rapid Transit made the plans and the decision essentially that future transit lines are going to be mostly underground. So that's when the decision was made. So just 3 years after the blizzard. So the timeline kind of works. But there are many other things that do not work. There are a lot of reasons why you would not want to go underground. So, as I mentioned, we got to think about 1891, which is when the decision was made, or 1888. It's the 1890-ish, that period. That's when they decided to go underground. That's right after the blizzard happened. So first of all, why not go underground? Well, they had other options. So there were elevated lines. They could have built more elevated lines. So at the time, around 1890, New York City had, this was the rapid transit system, the metro. It was an elevated system, mostly on steel structures. These were steam-powered, coal-fired locomotives pulling coaches. And it was pretty extensive. It covered most of Manhattan and the developed parts of Brooklyn. And this is much bigger than London's underground system. It was by far the largest rapid transit system in the world. So they had this huge system already. They certainly could have continued to expand it. And at the time, probably the seemingly the most obvious solution, maybe the most popular, I'm not sure, but the most obvious solution would have been to build, rather than steel, sort of a masonry viaduct, a viaduct railway. This is an older proposal, but it would look something like this. So by having a masonry structure instead of steel, it's much quieter. And because it's a solid structure, you don't have the sparks or the ashes and things falling down to the street below. So it would be much quieter and it would protect, block the soot from falling down. So it would be much, from the point of view of people who live there, it would be much more pleasant, and you'd still be above ground. So that was sort of the most realistic alternative. Again, if you go back to 1890, at the time, the only city that had an underground rapid transit system was London at this time. That was the only place that had it, apart from, tunnels. So, but in America, most people's experience, what would their experience have been? The closest would have been a train tunnel. People took trains a lot. They went through tunnels. What happens if you're on the train in 1890 and you go into a tunnel? It gets very dark. It gets very loud because of the walls, and it starts to become smoky inside. So, I mean, the trains would have had like kerosene lamps or something, but those are not that bright. So it's going to get a lot darker. And again, eventually you get the fumes, the smoke from the steam engine coming in, and it's just very loud. So it was like you get to this tunnel. It's a very unpleasant experience. So the idea of like a whole trip being like that was not an idea that people liked. And there's some great quotes. I think these quotes, this is from the Real Estate Record and Builder's Guide after the Rapid Transit Board announced their plans for a large underground system. They asked people what they thought of it, and you get a sense of what they thought of it. As to a tunnel, meaning an underground system, I think that whether it be shallow or deep, it will not be free from smells. Or someone else, I am not in favor of a tunnel, whether it be deep or shallow. I think it better to travel in the open air, and this could be done by viaducts through the yards and the rear buildings. Speaking for myself and not for the corporation which I represent, I may say that I am not in favor of an underground road. We should long since have taken the bull by the horns and built a viaduct road in the open air with daylight around us. And not everyone is against it, but I think this reflects a general view. Even people who are in favor of it, they often say, well, I think we can deal with the smells. I think it can be made quieter and not smoky with electricity and things like that. So, but this is very much in people's minds. And at the London Underground celebrated their 150th anniversary like more than a decade ago, but they ran some of the original trains that ran on the line. Now, I'm not sure what they're burning. I'm guessing it's not coal. So there would be coal and soot in that smoke as well, not just steam like you see here. And there would be train after train after train. So that's what people had in mind. So this going underground was not something people were excited about. It was not an obvious solution at all. And in fact, it was something that New Yorkers were proud of not having a system like that. So there's this guidebook, the King's Guide to New York, or King's Handbook of New York, a guidebook to the city. I think this is from 1892. And they talk about different parts of the city. They talk about transportation. The elevated railroad is the crowning achievement in solving the problems of rapid transit. By its aid, the New Yorkers fly through the air from end to end of their teeming island at railway speed and in comfortable and well-appointed cars. Instead of being whirled through the darkness and monotony and poisonous air of almost continuous tunnels, as in London, the New Yorkers are borne along swiftly and comfortably, high up above the streets, in view of the wonderful changing panorama of the Empire City, and in a fresh and wholesome atmosphere. A ride on the London Underground Metropolitan Railway is a depressing necessity, but a flight along the New York elevated rails is a refreshment. So again, going underground was not obvious at all. It was not something people were excited about. They were proud of the fact that it wasn't. And then there's a couple other reasons not to go underground. It was expensive. That's more expensive. So that's something to consider. And the other issue that at this time around 1890 was a big concern were building foundations. If you're going to dig into the street and build something underground, what is that going to do to the buildings? New York was having more and more skyscrapers at this time. So that was something that especially people in real estate were quite concerned about. Okay. So it's not obvious to go underground. I want to take another look at the Christiano article. So when you read it, essentially what Christiano is doing is gathering, a bunch of articles that were published right after the blizzard and describe what happened. And they do describe in a lot of detail the problems, especially with the elevated trains. The elevated trains were, they didn't entirely stop, but they were hugely impacted, and there was a big problem. They couldn't get on a train because there weren't trains, or they were on a train and they couldn't get off the train because it was stranded. So they talk about the problems, but there's 5 articles, but there's really only one place that I can see where anyone is actually saying we should build transit underground. They're saying there's a problem. There were problems. It got stuck, but they're not saying we should go underground except for here. This is a quote from the article, which Christiano is quoting from 1888. Now, 2 things tolerably certain: that a system of a really rapid transit, which cannot be made inoperable by storms, must be straightway devised and as speedily as possible constructed, and that all the electric wires, telegraph, telephone, fire alarms, and illuminating must be put underground without any delay. Now, that's kind of a long sentence. It's a little bit confusing, so I wanted to look at the original, or New York Times, they have the reprints, which are wonderful, that you could buy. And if you look at the actual printing, which is here, there's 4 differences. One I don't think makes a difference. It's actually inoperative, not inoperable. But these other 3 make it actually much clearer. And again, I don't blame Christiano. It's wonderful that they put together all these sources and they were writing. There's a lot that they were typing up, so I forgive the mistakes. But to understand what the thinking was, it's actually much clearer if you read it from the original copy here. Now, there's actually, that comment doesn't really make any difference, but now, 2 things are tolerably certain: that a system of a really rapid transit, which cannot be made inoperative by storms, must be straightway devised and as speedily as possible constructed, and that all the electric wires, telegraph, telephone, fire alarms, and illuminating must be put underground without any delay. So when you have the M dash and the comma and the R, it's much clearer that what the 2 things are. So they're saying they're actually separating. They're actually saying not to put the trains underground. They're specifically saying 2 things: that we need a system of transit that wouldn't be made inoperative by the storms, and that the electric wires, etc., must be put underground. They're specifically not saying that the train should be underground. They're just saying we need to make it work during a storm. Again, I focus on this because this is the only quote where I can see anyone saying that the train should be underground. And again, this is just the New York Times, so it's not like these are people designing the subways, but it's the only one I see. And that, when you look at it closer, they're actually saying not to put it underground. So, why does New York City have a subway? Why was it actually designed to be underground? Well, there's not a single dominant reason like the blizzard of 1888. Some of the other design choices do have one or two clear dominant reasons, but not really underground. It was sort of the sum of different options that they had. So again, the viaduct system, something like this, was sort of what seemed like the most common sense or the most practical thing you could do. It was elevated, but it would deal with some of the issues of, it would be quieter, collect the soot, etc. But building this, first of all, over an avenue, this is crossing the street, but if you're to build it over the major thoroughfares, you almost entirely block the street. You'd be creating your own congestion. It would fit much better to go parallel to the major streets and over through the middle of blocks, essentially parallel to the major streets, crossing over the side streets, as is pictured here. But that would mean you have to buy all this private property on every block that you're going to cross over. They were concerned that that was going to just take too much time. So again, what I'm talking about here is I'm talking about the Board of Rapid Transit and their engineers, the people who actually made the decision to go underground. What was their thinking? What were they considering when they decided that we should have a system largely underground? When they made that decision, and this is what they were thinking about. This is what they wrote. So a viaduct's really only going to fit between the avenues, not over the major thoroughfares. And if you go between them, they thought it's going to take way too much time to try to acquire all that property. It's also not going to be as convenient. They really wanted to directly follow, if possible, Broadway or other major thoroughfares, because that's where most of the traffic was. That's where you'd provide most of the congestion relief. That's where you'd make more money. So they wanted to be ideally along Broadway and along the major thoroughfares. Now, another issue that came up was that part of Broadway below 33rd Street was illegal. They couldn't build an elevated structure. Wasn't allowed. So that major part of the road already would have had to be underground if they wanted to be along Broadway, which they did, to make it more convenient, to make it more profitable. A couple other things they were considering: it minimized the number of steps to get to the platform by going underground. This viaduct system, I don't think this is to scale, but still, it would have been pretty high up, and to have a system right beneath the surface was going to be a lot fewer steps to get to. They're very concerned about making it convenient to access. So that was something that was not, there was really not a single decisive factor, but that was something that they do mention as to why it's better to go underground. Fewer steps, more convenient. It's going to be more ridership, more congestion relief, more profitable. And the last thing really was just the technology. They were pretty convinced that by this time, this is 1891, that the electric propulsion could handle it. They didn't say it had to be electric, something non-combustible is what they say, but that electricity was ready to do the job of the lighting and the propulsion. They also thought they had ideas about how it could be quieter. They thought because New York City Subway is a 4-track system, having all 4 tracks on one level, in one big tunnel, essentially, they thought it would be quieter. I'm not sure if that's really true or not. They thought by having it's very close to the surface, which is going to be another video, but that why it's so close to the surface, it'd be easy to ventilate, so it would be, even if it's electric, you still want to have fresh air. So they thought they could do that. And the construction, they had ideas about how to build it which weren't actually used, but in their mind could be used and would prevent the building foundations from being affected. Now, a couple of things about going underground. It's not entirely underground. About a third of the subway is elevated. It's just mostly underground, so we call it a subway. And that is because it was expensive to go underground. So in the most congested areas, the most developed areas, it was underground. So where they could afford it, they went underground. So the reason it's not entirely underground is mainly because of cost. And just lastly, they never talk about weather. The people who made the decision, the Board of Rapid Transit, the engineers on the commission, they never talk about weather, storms, blizzard, anything like that. When they explain why they came with the design, they never talk about it. Maybe in the Boston subway, it was a factor. And I think probably for the electric utilities in New York, it was part of why they put them underground. The electric utilities really were dangerous because you could be walking the snow, and if these broken wires could, I think, did electrocute people. Whereas with the trains, you could just not run them during the blizzard. So again, maybe the electric utilities, maybe the Boston subway went underground, but not in New York. It was not. No one mentions it, but I'd welcome any feedback. If you know of any sources or information about that suggests that that was actually a consideration, I would love to see it. Leave a comment, please. So, in summary, what we're talking about is the thinking of the people who made the decision for New York City to have a subway, a largely underground rapid transit system. That was the Board of Rapid Transit in 1891. That commission, those engineers, they laid out the basic design that was followed on the rest of the system. Their thinking was, it might seem obvious now to go underground, but it's actually a pretty bold decision at the time to build a largely underground system. Their reasons, they thought it'd be faster to build it that way because by going underground below the streets, you wouldn't have to acquire private property. I thought it would be, they wanted to maximize the congestion relief by following the major routes directly. That's also going to make it more profitable. And they weren't allowed to follow the major streets in some places, parts, Broadway, parts of Madison Avenue. It wasn't legal to build above ground. They had to go underground to do that. It minimized the number of steps to make it more convenient. And they thought that the technology was sufficiently developed. And so where they could afford it, they wanted the system to be underground. So there you go. Take care, everyone.